This is the 35mm Sigma 1.4 Art Series lens for the Sony E-mount, and today we're going to take a look at it and we're going to ask some important questions. What is it like to shoot with? With a lens this big, do you still look cool? And more importantly, if I shoot for this long enough, will one of my biceps be bigger than the other? Those questions and more answered in just a second. This is the Sigma 35mm 1.4 for the Sony E-mount. I've had some viewers taking a look at the video I did on the 24mm, and I'm really pleased. Thank you for taking a look at that. Thank you for coming back to this video. We're going to be examining this lens, talking about it, talking about what it's like to shoot with, and then I'm going to give it a totally important and not at all arbitrary rating. But first, let's examine the lens. So this is its size. Well, actually, let's be fair, take the hood off. That's its size. Just as with the other lenses, it is essentially the Canon 35mm 1.4 with an added MC11 adapter onto it. I shot this on my Sony a7R Mark III, and I had some good experiences with it. But let's talk about the lens itself first. So first of all, the aperture range is from f1.4 to f16. No f22, no f29 in that side of this lens. Like with the other Sigma art lenses, there is no stabilization and no official weather sealing inside of it. And as I talked about in my video on the 24mm, it is not officially a native lens. It was not designed specifically for the Sony system and the way the Sony system focuses. And we're going to deal with focusing in a second. So it has 5 individual elements that are specifically there to control for chromatic aberration. And let's talk about that very briefly. Just as was my experience with the 24mm, I loved the color rendition off of this lens. I thought it was accurate, I thought it was vibrant, and I did not have color fringing or chromatic aberration at all as I was working with this lens. So just like with the 24mm, those elements really did the job that they were advertised to do. So I was very pleased with that. It's not a natively designed lens for the Sony E-mount system, but still it has a hypersonic autofocus motor that's supposed to improve its speed. And let's deal with focusing. So I took this lens with my family to the zoo and had a really good time shooting it and enjoying working with it at really close and medium distances with my son and with my wife. Not too much with the animals. It's a wide-angle lens on a full-frame camera. But I did a series of shots where my son was walking towards me, and I used subject tracking on my camera trying to keep up with him. And I have to say, it did it. It did it. I was pleased with the focusing operation. I know it's not a native lens, but the focusing operation was as smooth as with my 55mm Zeiss or my 85mm Batis. And it kept up with tracking. It was constantly operating. When I went from near to far and far to near, it was fast in the operation. So I did not experience any kind of a difference when I was working with this particular lens with the autofocus operation relative to a native lens. So good experiences there. Subjects moving at me, and I did a series of shots where I was walking in tandem alongside my subject, which was my wife holding my son, and shooting pictures as we're moving together. And it kept up with continuously focusing there. It worked with subject tracking, it worked with face detection. I was pleased with the autofocus operation off of this as a non-native lens. As I've said before, I'm going to keep my eye on this because the bigger the lens gets, and we haven't seen the 85mm yet, but the bigger the lens gets, the more glass, and I'm assuming the slower it's going to become. So we're going to take a look at that. It is a rounded 9-blade diaphragm aperture that's specifically done for the quality of the background defocus, but let's be fair, 35mm doesn't provide that kind of really rich, beautiful background defocus that we look for in an 85 or a 135. And so that's a nice thing. But I really think the main reason that Sigma has that type of blade construction in all of their art lenses is just for ease of manufacturing. I don't think it matters as much that it's a rounded blade. diaphragm in this one, but the background that's defocused certainly didn't look non-pleasing by any means. As with the 24mm lens, it is again a thermally stable composite material, still the coolest thing that I've heard described in a lens construction. And if you haven't seen that video, what that means is they built the lens specifically out of materials that are designed to operate in extreme temperatures, hot and cold. And that's a really key thing if somebody is taking this to do landscapes in the Antarctic. It's a really powerful thing if you're taking it to shoot pictures in really, really humid and very hot temperatures. But that wasn't my situation. I was shooting in the upper 70s at the top end and the lower 70s in the low end. So I did not have the opportunity to put that claim to the test. I see no reason to doubt it off the top of my head, but that's where I'm coming from with it. And let's talk about design, build, and feel for a second. So lens hood is an okay kind of feel, a little bit plasticky in its construction, but the lens is really beautiful to handhold. It's beautiful to feel. It's a nice sized grip for the manual focus ring. I find it easy to find and move and use. The material itself really nice and solid, and I like the weight. It feels nice and weighted in the hand. Another thing that's beautiful about this lens is right here, just like with the 24mm, it has a hyperfocal calculator on it. Right there next to the window that shows the distance you focused to. I love these. Anyone from any lens manufacturer, please make more of these. It's fantastic. Hyperfocal calculators are so useful. Now, I think it's more useful for the 24mm since 24mm is more of a landscape lens, but let's be fair, I actually prefer shooting landscape on 35 rather than 24. I find 24 to be a little bit too wide angle for much of what I want to do. It pushes my background too far away. So 35 I find to be a nice, beautiful wide angle for a lot of scenic kind of situations. However, there is a problem with the hyperfocal calculator on it. This hyperfocal calculator specifically and only lists f/16. Now with the 24mm, it lists f/8 and f/16. I didn't have too much of a problem with that because if I'm doing hyperfocal calculation for a landscape, I'm not going to be brighter than f/8, and the lens doesn't stop down past f/16. So those two numbers were the top and bottom end of my usable range. I wished that it had f/11. With the 35mm, it's assuming I'm going to do all of my hyperfocal calculation at f/16, and that's just not the case. A lot of us don't like using f/16 because we worry about diffraction and a lack of sharpness, so we prefer our landscapes between f/8 and f/11. That's me. That's where I prefer to shoot. I don't shoot dimmer than f/11 if I can help it, and so to put just f/16 on the hyperfocal calculator I think ignores a lot of us who are kind of lens nerds. And let's be fair, if you're doing hyperfocal calculation, you're probably a lens nerd too, which is great. Welcome to the community. It's fantastic. Working with this lens, it started to get overcast when I was shooting, and I got to tell you, I was thinking about wishing I had something that was actually officially labeled as weather sealed. It didn't end up raining on me, so I didn't put any of that to the test. But it's something that I'm cognizant of as I'm shooting with an art lens, and wishing that I kind of had that. Now, I want to talk about sharpness here because I wasn't thrilled. I was happy, but not thrilled with the 24mm. So let's talk about the 35. The 24mm I didn't feel was sharper than the 16-35 f4, and I certainly felt that it was less sharp in the corners than the 16-35 f4. This lens I have a different opinion on. I loved its center sharpness. Loved it. Thought it was great. The center sharpness when I didn't motion blur it, and I find that to be a little bit easier than I would have anticipated. Just as with the 24mm, but when this thing is sharp in the center, it's exquisite. It's wonderful. There is so much beautiful contrast and detail And of course, we've talked about the color coming off of it and the lack of fringing. It's one of the most beautifully center sharp lenses that I've used in a little while. What about the corners? There's loss there for sure, to a degree that it doesn't feel like a real high-end prime to me in that respect. But it's better in my opinion than the 24 millimeter was. So improvement there. Now that's probably because it's easier to maintain corner sharpness when you're not so wide as the 24. One day I'm going to get around to shooting with and reviewing the 20 millimeter, and I expect significant loss on the sides at this point, but I stand ready to be corrected. Center sharpness is gorgeous, contrast is gorgeous, color is gorgeous. This is a good 35. And I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here and say at this moment, and I'm recording this in July of 2018, if you're coming to this video later on, at this moment, value for money is really good on this lens. It's $900. Right now, I took a look and I think this is going to be a pretty popular lens. It is currently sold out at B&H. It is in stock at Mike's Camera in Colorado. You can check out, they've got a website. I know it's in stock there, at least a few of them, but it is already sold out at B&H. And I think it's going to be popular for a little while. And I think that's because there are three 35 millimeters for this system that are autofocus. So the Loxia doesn't count for me at this point, though it's a lens that I very dearly want to shoot with. There's a 35 2.8 pancake lens. It's been out for like 4 years, and that's not particularly bright for a 35 millimeter for a prime. That's a non-macro prime. There's a 35-1.4 in my hand, and there's a 35-1.4 from Sony. Now that lens has a lot going for it. It has a nice clicked and declicked controlled aperture ring on it in third stop increments. Beautiful, but it is bigger than this guy. It is heavier than this guy, and it's like $700 more expensive. And for what? Well, there's a couple things. Obviously the click control, obviously the aperture ring. Another thing on it, it is stabilized. And another is the throw of the manual focus ring. And I want to talk about that real fast because we're comparing two lenses here. The throw of the manual focus on this lens from minimum focus to infinity is about 90 degrees. It's about 90 degrees. That's too shallow for me. Personally, when I'm trying to pull focus, particularly if I'm shooting manual focus video or just trying to be minute in my control for a landscape shot, that little bit of latitude for focusing is just not enough. I prefer something close to 170 degree throw from minimum focusing to infinity. And this is a little bit too shallow, and the Zeiss glass 35 millimeter from Sony has a little bit longer of a throw to it. But it's a $700 difference. And this is a stinking good lens. So there's a big audience for this right now. I think there's a bigger audience for this than for the 50 millimeter art. And there's probably a bigger audience than for the 85 millimeter art. We're going to see, I think the 20 millimeters got a lot going for it, particularly for the astro community out there. But 35 doesn't have a lot of competition. And so there's a lot going for this lens. And so I think value for money right now in high quality glass center sharpness for the Sony E-mount, there's not a lot of competition there. And I mean, if you wanted to have a really good normal view lens on an A6000, by God, it'd be interesting. You'd look a little weird to me, but you could do it and it would work very well. So those are my thoughts on working with this. I liked this lens. I liked it better than the 24 millimeter. I enjoyed working with it, and a 35 prime has a great use factor to it. It's great for group shots as a wedding photographer. It's fantastic for a lot of medium landscape shots. It's wonderful to shoot family events and kids with, as I found out. It's got so much practicality. When I go to do a portrait shoot, I don't bring ranged lenses anymore. 35 if I've got a real family or group, right? A 50 and an 85. And that's all I need besides my lighting equipment. So this has a ton of purpose to it right now. Anyway, what I'd like to do next is show you a couple example images from it so you can see for yourself what it's like to work with.
So first, let's examine my claim about the center sharpness of this lens. Here's probably my favorite shot from the whole day, and let's jump into 100% here. Oops, that's 67%. Let's move in. There's 100, and pull this in. And center sharpness in this lens is just exquisite. I love the quality of the look off of this. I think it just turned out great. So center sharpness, contrast, the way it separates from background, it really turned out great. This is a wonderfully center sharp lens. Now let's take a look at the way that changes across the range of the lens. So here we've got center sharpness, which I think turned out great right here. I'm very happy with that. But let's start scrolling up. And of course, this is all equidistant, and we're losing information here at that corner there, and you can see where it's sharp and then where it's lost. And let's go to the bottom part here, and we can see sharp and where it starts being lost there. And so there's definitely some loss in that side-to-side on the lens, and you can actually see it here. Not nearly as much, just because I'm missing that part here. So we're only barely seeing a little bit of loss on the side. And if we look over here, we can see a little bit, but really not as much. I'm seeing it top and bottom here. Same thing going on here. With this, I've got my center sharpness points, and then I can move to the side and see that, this crane here is pretty similar to this one here, but certainly not the same degree of sharpness. So there's definitely loss going side to side. When we look at bold color here, and again, we've got this 67%. Let's go ahead and jump into 100%. As we take a look at color and color boldness sitting next to each other. And I got to say, I did not produce chromatic aberration off of this lens. I think that color contrast and color quality just turned out fantastic off of the lens. So really good results there, with the exception of some side-to-side corner sharpness, as we can see from this example.
So those are some images I shot with the lens. I think it's a good lens, but right now, it's time to do some important stuff. First, we have to ask some very important questions about this lens, now that we've gotten to know it a little bit, and then it's time to give it a totally important and not at all arbitrary rating. No. Kinda. Yes.
So time for a totally important and not at all arbitrary rating, starting with the beginner usage. We're going to start with ease of use. It's a prime lens after all, but it's a normal view prime, so we're going to call that 3 out of 5. Size and weight are reasonable relative to other lenses in its category and in its focal length, so I'm going to give that about a 3 out of 5. It is a pretty big lens, as Sigma Arts are known to be. Flexibility, I'm going to give this a 3 out of 5. 35 millimeters is a good focal length, but for beginners, flexibility is not something they think of when they're thinking of a prime lens. Now, growth potential, this is going to get my very first 5 out of 5 rating on this YouTube channel. I think 35 millimeter growth potential is just wonderful, almost independent of the type of shooting you want to do. Coolness factor, it's a Sigma lens after all. Sigma Art is cool, so we're giving this guy a 4 out of 5. And as I said before, it does get an additional point for dopeness, and that brings its total in the beginner usage category to 19 out of 25. Starting with the enthusiast category here, And for enthusiasts, we start with build quality, and I'm going to have to give it a 4 out of 5. I just can't give something without weather sealing a 5 out of 5 build quality. Image quality, center sharpness is exquisite, but I've got to tell you that the corners still aren't as good as I would want from a Pro Glass Prime, so I'm giving this a 4 out of 5. Focusing speed is improved over the 24mm, but it still is nothing to write home about, so I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Features, I really have to give it a 2 out of 5. It's not native, it's not weather sealed, it's not stabilized, so it's really not too impressive on that front. But value for money, I am impressed with it, especially with what's available in the market today, and so it's getting a 4 out of 5, giving its enthusiast category an 18 out of 25.
So that's the Sigma 35mm Art 1.4 for the Sony E-mount system. My analysis, I like this lens. I think it's a good lens. I'm going to recommend it to people. I'm going to consider it for myself for my Sony system. Its center sharpness is great. It has some drawbacks, but I'm spending a lot less money than the Sony 35-1.4, and so that's fair to me. This lens has a real place in the lineup until we start seeing high-quality glass at a 1.8. I'm looking at you, Tamron. Anyway, those are my thoughts. What are you going to use the 35mm for? What lens would you like to see me review next? Get in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, I'm Joe from Camera Lessons Online, and have a wonderful day. By the way, don't forget to subscribe. It's free. You knew that already, right? All right, I'll see you next time. Take care.